Welcome everyone to our 10-minute Bible lesson. We appreciate you joining us today. You know, we have finished up our lessons on discipleship. Now, I think there were 13 of them, and the last two were kind of tough lessons because they were on tithing. But you know, sometimes those lessons that are tough for us are also really good for us. Now, I'm kind of a little hesitant to tell you the subject today because it's kind of another tough lesson. And I just want to ask you, do you think that you're up for another one? Because the title of this lesson, or the subject of this lesson, is obedience. Now, if I'm kind of on the other side and I'm listening to somebody talk and their subject is going to be, their Bible lesson is going to be on obedience, I might go, oh no. Now, why would I do that? Why would I go, oh my? You know, I think that the reason would be is because maybe there's some areas that I haven't been obedient and I'm going to kind of, sort of feel bad about it. But I have to ask you this question, and I think it's kind of a no-brainer question. Does God expect Christians to be obedient? And I'm thinking you're going to say, well, yeah, no, that's an obvious, that's a no-brainer. Of course he does. And then I would change the question to ask this. Now it's a little closer to home. Does God expect you to be obedient? And even more closer would be this. Does God expect me to be obedient? And I kind of have to swallow hard. I'd like to say, well, he wants other people, but no, listen, he wants me to be obedient too. So I just think, it's really, even though it's kind of a tough lesson, I think it's good for us and it's important to us. In fact, the Bible certainly teaches us that. Now, we kind of live in a day, in our time and day that we're living in, it bothers me a little bit because I'm thinking that we have, people who they trust Jesus, they believe Jesus to forgive their sins and to be their Savior. But, I think that sometimes they kind of feel like, but I'm going to go ahead and do what I want to do. And that kind of troubles me and bothers me. And I don't think that's the way it's supposed to be. And that's one of the reasons I'm giving this lesson. Now, if you could think of what a mark for a Christian is, or a mark for a believer, we had some lessons a while back on the subject of love. And love is a mark of a Christian. But there's another mark for a Christian, and that would be obedience. So another thing that kind of helps identify a Christian is obedience. Now, there's a passage that Paul talks about in Ephesians, and in this passage, he identifies. Now, listen carefully to me. He identifies those that are not obedient as not being Christians. So in other words, he kind of labels the ones who are disobedient as people that haven't been saved. Now let me read the verse and see if you agree with me. Especially I'd like for you to notice the last part of this verse. So this is in Ephesians chapter 2, the first two verses 1 and 2. And here's what Paul says. He says, "And you he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air." Now listen to this especially. "To the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience." So who are the sons of disobedience? Let me say it another way. Who are the children of disobedience? Well, it's certainly those that you have to consider that haven't been transformed from death to life. And in other words, they're still following the course of this world, and they're still following the prince of the power of the air. So I think that Paul is making a point here. Now, let me just say something else. That disobedience is a sign. In other words, disobedience is a characteristic of those that have not yet been saved. Just as obedience is a characteristic of those who have been saved. So I'm reminded of a passage in the Old Testament. Now maybe you're familiar with this passage too. I've always thought it was a sad passage. Now, the passage is a passage that tells us about something that King Saul did. Now, God had ordered King Saul to go to war against his enemies. And he told him to kill the enemies, all of them, and even their livestock. And so when Saul went to war, he did. He killed all the enemies, but you know what he did? He saved all of the livestock. And when that happened, the prophet Samuel confronted him, and kind of had something to say about him. So King Saul, he said he was going to save the livestock to sacrifice to God. But here's what Samuel said in 1 Samuel chapter 15, I believe it's verse 22. Here's what he said. So Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold," Samuel says, "to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams." And here's the part that I thought was just kind of made me sad. And the next verse, because this is in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 23, because it was like God was going to pass a judgment on King Saul. And here's what he said to him. He said, "For rebellion," apparently God looks at disobedience like rebellion. He says, "For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry." Now here's the part I wanted to mention. "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king." Now that was a sad part. I think though, when we look at this, we need to understand two things. Number one, obedience is really, really an important thing to God. In fact, it's much more important to God than our sacrifices. Now, sacrifices are good, but God would rather have us obedient. And here we read in here where God actually rejected Saul from being king, and the reason he did was because he wasn't obedient. Now, God wanted a king that would obey him. Now we know that eventually he set aside Saul and he brought up King David, who was an obedient king. Well, now let me just say this. I don't want to leave on a negative note, but I want to say this, that all of us have been disobedient. We all from time to time disobey God. But the good news is this, is that we can get forgiveness. We can tell God that we're sorry, and we are. It makes us feel bad. Listen, if you have God in your heart and you don't obey God, it makes you feel bad. But the good thing is that God's not going to just send us to hell because we disobey. If we go to him and ask him forgiveness, listen, it's such a good news that he'll forgive us. So what should we do? We should confess the sin and ask him to forgive us. Now, let me just, because I think it's hard to obey. Let's be frank, some things are hard to obey. Here's what I think is a good way to become obedient, or for God to help us to be obedient, is just to confess to God, "God, I'm really having a hard time obeying you in this." Just tell God, he already knows it. So tell him this and say, "I'm sorry. I need your help to help me to be able to accomplish what you want me to obey in my life." And God is loving and he cares about us and he'll help us. And I think that's a great way for us to become more and more obedient. But listen, I appreciate you tuning in today. I know it was a little bit of a tough lesson, but I appreciate it. I hope you have a really good week, and we'll see you next time.